Russia isn't on the verge of collapse. It's already entered it. Not with explosions, not with revolutions, but with a slow, silent death from within. The government still exists on paper. The map still says Russia, sure, but beneath the surface, something far more dangerous is unfolding. A hollow collapse. The institutions, gutted. The regions, withholding taxes. The security services, fragmenting into warlord armies. And in Moscow, a regime shredding its own talent just to stay in control. This isn't a return to 1991, it's something far worse. A time of chaos where the Russian state remains intact while everything inside it falls apart. And the longer it drags on, the more dangerous it becomes. Not just for Russia, but for the entire world. Let's break it down. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it was ugly, but it was a political divorce. Ministries became ministries under new flags. Taxes still got collected. Police still showed up. Trains still ran. The successor states that emerged were messy, corrupt, often brutal, but they functioned. There were institutions. There was continuity. There was someone to pick up the phone when the world called. What Russia faces now is fundamentally different. This isn't about new borders or new flags. It's about a state that looks perfectly normal from the outside while rotting from the inside. A zombie-like government, a hollow shell where the machinery of power still hums, but none of it actually works. Historians have seen this pattern before. In the 17th century, Russia went through something eerily similar, a period of total internal collapse that lasted over a decade. The dynasty died out. The central government evaporated. Warlords, pretenders, and foreign powers all carved up the country, while famine killed up to a third of the population. The borders stayed the same, the state did not. And 400 years later, the conditions for that kind of implosion are being rebuilt, deliberately, by the very system designed to prevent it. The reason comes down to one man's obsession with staying in charge and the machine that he built to guarantee it. Political scientists have a name for what Russia has become. They call it a personalist autocracy, a system where every decision, every appointment, every ruble flows through a single leader. And research from the University of Chicago, covering 179 countries over decades, has found something devastating about these regimes. They consistently underperform on every metric that matters. Lower GDP growth, just 1.37% annually, compared to 2.31% for institutionalized autocracies and 2.4% for democracies. Worse public services, higher risk of conflict, and the most dangerous finding of all, that they're structurally incapable of surviving the departure of the person at the top. Why? Well, because of something that we call the talent shredder. In a personalist system, competence is a threat. A charismatic governor who solves problems can steal the spotlight. A capable general who inspires loyalty in the ranks, he becomes a rival. A brilliant minister who tells the truth becomes a liability. So what does the system do? It promotes the safest people, not the smartest, the loyal, not the skilled, the silent, not the bold. Over time, the entire bureaucracy is filled with yes men and obedient performers. Analysis of Russia's political elite by the Marshall Center shows that 60% of the most powerful figures have sat in their positions for decades, drawn almost exclusively from the security services or Putin's personal circles in St. Petersburg. It's not a government, it's a loyalty club wearing official uniforms. And there's a layer that most people miss: the internal culture of humiliation. When power is built on fear, you don't need written rules. Everyone understands that one wrong phrase, one inconvenient truth, one moment of independence can end your career, or worse. That atmosphere selects a very specific type of person, the obedient performer, not the builder, not the crisis manager, not the professional who tells you what you don't want to hear. The system breeds a bureaucracy that functions only when someone at the top is giving orders, and freezes the moment that voice goes silent. And it goes deeper than just the top brass. A Cambridge University study analyzed over 100,000 mayoral candidates across Russia and found that independent, highly educated challengers are systematically rejected by local election commissions. Candidates with prior governing experience, private sector wealth, or autonomous credibility, they get filtered out before they can even run. The system doesn't just ignore talent. It actively hunts it down and removes it from the playing field. The result? Regions across the country are now governed by so-called Varangian officials. Bureaucrats parachuted in from Moscow with zero connection to the people that they rule. They don't answer to their citizens. They answer to Kremlin-designed key performance indicators. And the moment the center stops giving orders, Well, these officials will be the first ones on a plane out of the country. They have no local base, no loyalty, no reason to stay when the music stops. Now think about what that means. Every capable administrator has been purged. Every independent thinker has been silenced or exiled. The people left running the country are the ones least equipped to manage a crisis. And that crisis, well, it's already at the door. But gutting the talent pool is only half the story. Because when the money stops flowing, that's when the real nightmare begins. Russia's entire federal system runs on a single principle. Moscow pays, Moscow controls. The federal transfer system redistributes about 26% of the country's fiscal resources, keeping poor regions alive with subsidies while skimming revenue from richer ones. In places like Dagestan or Tuva, federal transfers account for roughly 2/3 of all revenue. These regions don't just depend on Moscow, they can't breathe without it. That dependency was engineered on purpose. It's a leash. As long as the money flows, governors behave. But the moment Moscow can't pay, the leash snaps. And Moscow is running out of money faster than anyone expected. Russia's consolidated budget deficit hit nearly 4% of GDP in 2025, the worst since the full-scale invasion began. Oil and gas revenues plunged 24% to a 5-year low. The federal deficit alone reached 5.65 trillion rubles, the largest since at least 1996. Total government spending surged to nearly 43 trillion rubles, while the National Wealth Fund, the country's emergency reserves, is being drained so fast that analysts at the Gaidar Institute warn that it might be depleted by late 2026. Russia's public debt is projected to hit 20% of GDP, the highest since 1999. And here's the squeeze that nobody in Moscow wants to talk about. The war is eating the budget alive. Military spending has consumed a record share of federal resources, crowding out everything else. Federal transfers to the regions have been cut now for 2 consecutive years. Regional governments are now shouldering an ever-growing share of war costs, sign-on bonuses for soldiers, compensation for casualties, reconstruction of border areas hit by Ukrainian drone strikes. Some regions have already started cutting those bonuses because they simply can't afford them anymore. The money is running out at every level of government simultaneously. Now here's where it gets dangerous. We've already seen what happens when Moscow stops paying. In 1998, when the Russian government defaulted on its debt and the ruble collapsed, regional governors didn't wait for instructions. They withheld taxes, they prioritized their own populations, meaning food, salaries, local services, and simply ignored federal directives. And they were rewarded for it politically. Voters loved a governor who kept the lights on while Moscow burned. You don't need a political movement for this to happen. You don't need ideology. You just need empty fridges and unpaid police. In 1998, coal miners in Vorkuta and Kuzbas went months without wages and escalated into the famous rail war, blocking key railway lines to force payment. That was a small-scale preview. The next one would be a full feature. A future version of that scenario would be exponentially worse, because the regions are now even more dependent on Moscow than they were in the 90s. The federal government has replaced risky regional debt with low-interest budgetary loans, deepening the financial addiction. If the center collapses, the regions, well, they don't have a fallback plan. They've got nothing. And that's when the death spiral kicks in. The center gets weaker, so it pays less. Because it pays less, it receives less in tax revenue. Because it receives less, it pays even less. Decrees from Moscow stop being executed, not because of ideology, but because nobody gets rewarded for obedience anymore. Wealthier regions like Moscow and the Urals start hoarding their own resources. Poorer regions sink into humanitarian crisis. The state doesn't break apart on a map, it just stops functioning at the regional border. And when the money dries up, something far more dangerous fills the vacuum. Not ideology and not revolution, violence. Russia already has a sprawling ecosystem of privatized force. Private military companies, corporate security firms, licensed and unlicensed enforcers, former special forces operators working as fixers and muscle for hire. Now, in normal times, this shadow army sits beneath the state. But when the state can no longer guarantee safety, contracts, or property rights, well, these groups don't disappear. They just change their employer. Private military companies are technically illegal under Article 359 of the Russian Criminal Code, punishable by up to 8 years in prison. But the Kremlin has quietly encouraged their growth for years, using them as deniable proxies everywhere from Syria to sub-Saharan Africa. Wagner proved that the model works. You build your own intelligence network, you sign up your own resource contracts, recruit your own army, and when your patron falls, you simply just find a new one. In a hollow collapse, thousands of returning war veterans became a recruitment pool for whoever can pay. Russia has already suffered more than 1.2 million battlefield casualties since February of 2022, according to CSIS. That's more losses than any major power in any conflict since World War II. Up to 325,000 are dead. Hundreds of thousands more wounded, many permanently disabled. Russia is already seeing spikes in violent crime linked to returning fighters, including ex-convicts who were recruited straight from prison to serve on the front lines. These men came home to an economy that can't employ them and a state that can't support them. Local governors, business oligarchs, organized crime bosses, all of them will compete for this pool of trained fighters. Violence becomes a market. Armed groups fight over transit routes, resource sites, and the protection of local elites. Russia has a dark preview of exactly what that looks like. In the late 1990s, after the first Chechen War, the separatist government's failure to maintain order turned kidnapping into Chechny's primary economy. Between 1996 and 1999, rogue commanders and criminal networks abducted hundreds of people for ransom, generating over $200 million. In 1998, 4 foreign telecom engineers were kidnapped in Grozny and beheaded when negotiations failed. That wasn't chaos for the sake of chaos, it was a business model. Once armed groups discovered that a human body is basically a bank account with legs, that lesson doesn't unlearn easily. And when a state hollows out, that model, it scales, and fast. But we haven't even reached the most terrifying part of this story yet. Hey, if you're finding this breakdown valuable, be sure to subscribe to Fall of Nations. It helps us bring you deeper analysis that the mainstream media won't touch. Now, what does daily life actually look like inside a hollow state? It's not a sudden blackout, it's a slow, suffocating decay. A hospital may stay open, but the medicines that used to arrive through Moscow's based supply chains stop coming. A school holds classes, but the teachers haven't been paid in months, and the curriculum gets replaced by whatever the local strongman decides matters. Police still wear uniforms, but they become hired enforcers for whoever can feed them. Courts still exist on paper, but justice, it goes to the highest bidder. Property rights evaporate. You don't own your apartment because you have papers. You own it because you can defend the door. Banks are trust plus central coordination. Insurance is trust plus courts. Courts are trust plus enforcement. When those links snap, modern life collapses layer by layer. First, high-tech services. Then, everyday essentials. Then, basic safety. The people who can leave do. Russia's brain drain is already staggering. An estimated 900,000 people have left since 2022. Primarily young, highly educated professionals in IT, finance, and medicine. The country was short 2.2 million workers by the end of 2024, with 70% of companies expecting labor shortages. Russia's natural population declined by 596,000 people in 2024 alone, a 20% jump from the year before. The fertility rate has sunk to 1.4 children per woman, barely above the all-time low set in 1999. Carnegie researchers now call this demographic crisis more dangerous than the previous one, because the shock absorber that saved Russia last time, immigration from former Soviet states, well, that's largely dried up. In a collapse scenario, that exodus goes from a drain to a flood. And the people who can't leave? Pensioners, disabled citizens, wounded veterans returning from Ukraine with shattered bodies and no safety net. The last time that Russia saw anything comparable after the Afghan war in the 80s, violent crime exploded across the country. This time, the scale is incomparably larger. Environmental protections break down too, because enforcement, it costs money that nobody has. Illegal logging, industrial dumping, and neglected infrastructure disasters multiply. The complex systems that hold modern civilization together, energy grids, water treatment, transportation networks, they all start failing one by one. But none of that is the true nightmare scenario. The real horror is the nuclear arsenal. Russia possesses the world's largest stockpile of nuclear weapons. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Non-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program managed the risk posed by 30,000 warheads and 40,000 metric tons of chemical agents. Over 2 decades, it deactivated 7,616 warheads. It destroyed 926 ICBMs, eliminated 155 strategic bombers, and employed 58,000 weapon scientists in peaceful work. But that program worked because there was a functioning central government in Moscow to partner with. But in a hollow collapse, that partner doesn't exist. The authority to control nuclear storage facilities could devolve to local commanders, regional warlords, or the privatized security forces of whoever happens to control the territory. This is the nuclear Yugoslavia scenario the world narrowly avoided in 1991. Except this time, the center has been deliberately hollowed out of the professional competence needed to manage it. One unsecured facility, one desperate commander, one black market buyer. That's all it takes to turn a regional collapse into a global catastrophe. So who steps in when Russia can't govern itself? The most likely candidate? It isn't the West, it's China. Over the last 2 decades, Beijing has built a sophisticated system of rescue lending, a transactional form of aid where cash and infrastructure are exchanged for long-term access to natural resources. Since 2000, China has provided over $240 billion in rescue loans to more than 20 countries in financial distress. The playbook is called the Angola model. Liquidity now, resources forever. For a hollowed-out Russia, China wouldn't offer charity. It would offer a deal, money to keep the security services paid and the lights on in major cities, in exchange for exclusive rights to Russia's oil, gas, and minerals, and dominant influence over its strategic direction. Chinese-linked security contractors could end up guarding extraction sites deep in Siberia and the Far East. The country would remain, of course, Russia on a map, but its core economic and political functions will be managed from Beijing. This isn't speculation. China has already applied this exact model in resource-rich but institutionally weak states like Sudan, Angola, and the Central African Republic. The loans are opaque, the interest rates, they're steep, and the strings attached don't come off. For Russia, the result would be a new form of dependency, trading one kind of collapse for another kind of captivity. Not a rescue, but a quiet colonization dressed up as partnership. And the West? Well, the West has its own trap. Western policymakers love dealing with one strong man because it feels efficient. You have one phone call, one handshake, one deal. But that approach is a bit poisonous here. If outsiders help by empowering a single local boss, well, they may stabilize the surface, but they also rebuild the exact same personalist structure that caused the collapse. It's like putting the same cracked bolt back into the same wheel and acting surprised when it snaps again. The 1990s proved this. The West bet everything on Yeltsin as its reliable partner to secure the nuclear arsenal and manage the transition. Well, that bet, it produced Putin. So if backing a new czar won't work, what actually would? Real reconstruction means dismantling the personalist machine at its foundation. Not choosing a better leader, but building a system that doesn't need one. Georgia showed that it's possible. In 2004, after years of endemic corruption so deep that traffic cops were the primary extortion force in the country, the Georgian government fired 83% of its police officers outside the capital. It purged the old leadership entirely and rebuilt the force from scratch. Proper training, recorded interactions, and salaries high enough to discourage bribery. Public trust in police went from near zero to one of the highest in the former Soviet space within a few years. It wasn't perfect, but it proved that a rotten security apparatus can be rebuilt if you have the will to tear it down first. And for long-term stability, Russia would need something even more radical. Genuine integration with Europe at a human level. That sounds impossible today. It once sounded impossible for France and Germany too, after centuries of bloodshed and mutual hatred. But the 1963 Élysée Treaty built a framework that went far beyond diplomats. Student exchanges, town twinning, shared commemorations, youth programs that have since involved millions of young people. That's how hostility fades. Not because everyone becomes friends overnight, but because hatred, it stops being the default language. Russia would need all of it. Real checks and balances that actually bite. Genuine fiscal autonomy for regions so the all-or-nothing stakes of the center disappear. Humanities education to counter decades of cynical propaganda. And an independent judiciary that serves citizens rather than power. A parliamentary system that forces coalition building rather than one-man rule. And economic diversification. Because a country that lives off one revenue stream hands whoever controls that stream control over the entire political system. Multiple centers of income mean multiple centers of power. And that's the best insurance against the next strongman. None of this is easy. Most of it would take a generation. But the alternative is a cycle that Russia has been repeating for 400 years. Centralize, hollow out, collapse, repeat. Every time the destruction gets worse. And every time the recovery takes longer. Because here's the core warning of this entire story. A failed state is more dangerous than a divided one. Russia's worst-case scenario isn't a clean breakup with new flags and new borders. It's a country that looks whole on the map but functions like a graveyard, where institutions exist in name only. Violence replaces law. Nuclear weapons sit in facilities that no one competent is guarding. And the center holds nothing together except habit and fear. This isn't a war story. This isn't a sanctions story. This is a story of what happens when one man builds an entire country around himself. And the country discovers too late that there's nothing underneath. And that collapse, it isn't coming. It's already here. So what do you think? Is Russia past the point of no return? Or is there still a window to stop this spiral before it swallows everything? Drop your take in the comments. And look, if you want more in-depth collapse analysis that the mainstream won't cover, subscribe to Fall of Nations. And we'll see you in the next one.